The 2013 NFL season will probably go down as one of those seasons that, more than in recent years, let's say, kind of stuck true to the script. What I mean is that your two prohibitive preseason favorites to reach Super Bowl 48 next Sunday in New York were the Seattle Seahawks and the Denver Broncos. And both teams ultimately reached that final destination. Both teams went 13-3 in the regular season. Both teams had home field advantage throughout their conference playoffs. And both teams find themselves one game away from Super Bowl championship glory. So I wanted to do videos about why I feel both the Denver Broncos and the Seattle Seahawks actually are here now. Why they actually, above all the other organizations in the NFL, above all the other 30 teams, why they find themselves in the position that they do, being one game away from being Super Bowl champions. And congratulations to both teams. It's a really hard thing to be burdened with the expectations of being prohibitive preseason favorites, and both the Seahawks and the Broncos clearly were before the season started. And then to be able to deliver to those expectations is actually quite impressive. Both teams should be commended, and they both took their own kind of divergent paths during the season to reach this big moment. But today's video, I'm going to focus on why I believe the Denver Broncos are one step away from winning a championship in Super Bowl 48. Now, if I had to guess, the common perception for most people is that the only real reason the Denver Broncos find themselves playing for a championship in Super Bowl 48 is because they signed Peyton Manning 2 years ago. That's going to kind of be the predominant and prevailing logic, I truly believe. Obviously, that was a big, huge part of it, but if it is only dependent upon Peyton Manning alone, no matter what the national media tries to always say that it is all about Peyton Manning, if it was only ever about Peyton Manning alone, why did the Indianapolis Colts then only make it to 2 Super Bowls? And I say only, but still, they only made it to 2 Super Bowls in his 13 years as a starter there in Indianapolis. Just think about that. It takes more than that. And when you look at the Broncos first, it comes down to some decisions that have been made by that front office over the past 5 or 6 years. To me, it really started by moving on from Mike Shanahan after the 2008 season. His time had come, his time had gone, and it was time to move on. He just wasn't being as efficient and productive as he once had been. He was starting to make some bad decisions in the draft and free agency, and I think his organization, his team, his players were starting to tune him out a little bit. And that was a key thing, because the next thing that happened, some of you are going to look at it and say, oh, way to take a shot at the guy, but no, it is serious. The hiring of Josh McDaniels before that 2009 season led to the Broncos being able to move on from Jay Cutler. And not only move on from him, but get a pretty nice price in terms of 2 first-round picks, a third-round pick, and an NFL starting quarterback at the time, somebody to tide them over for a couple of seasons, in Kyle Orton. Think about it. The Broncos, after 3 years, had determined that the guy they had once drafted 11th overall in the 2006 draft wasn't going to be their guy, and they were ready to move on from him. They didn't feel like he was going to provide the type of leadership that they wanted. He wasn't going to be the face of the franchise that they wanted. So they did the right thing. Instead of continuing to try and go against the grain, they decided it was time to move on, and it ended up being best for all parties involved. And Jay Cutler trade, again, I cannot emphasize enough how huge and critical that became to the long-term plans for the Denver Broncos, because if you were still trying to sit there and win games with Jay Cutler, you might have never have signed Peyton Manning. Now, another key thing that happened was John Elway became the executive vice president of football operations and eventually took over all football operations pretty much. And I think he's brought a credibility to that front office. He's obviously done some really good things in that front office. And one good thing that he did was hiring John Fox. The thing about John Fox is it did not seem like an incredibly sensible hire. It really didn't. After the 2010 season, the Denver Broncos had the number 2 pick in the draft. The number 2 pick. The guy that they brought in to be their head coach led a team to 1 victory in the 2010 season. The Carolina Panthers had the number 1 overall pick. So you take a guy from the absolute worst team in the National Football League to bring him to the second worst team in the National Football League. Just think about that for a second. They brought in John Fox, and it has worked. So it goes beyond just bringing in, let's say, one individual player. It always takes an organization to do things right, to put a team in a position to win championships, even if the players ultimately and the coaches have to win or lose those championships. Organizations have to make good decisions. They have to do the right things, and they have to put the right pieces in place. So you figure between getting rid of Mike Shanahan, to trading away Jay Cutler and moving on as an organization, to bringing in Pat Bowlen, bringing in John Elway as an executive vice president of football operations, to hiring John Fox, which is not the slam dunk pick that it might look like 3 years later. Because again, you're talking about a guy who had coached a 1-15 Carolina Panthers team in the 2010 season. That's a tough sell to your fan base. It really, really is. So they did some good things there. Another successful area for the Denver Broncos in helping to build them into a Super Bowl contending team has been their work in the NFL draft. Perhaps the most important thing you could do as an organization to build yourself into a potential future championship contending team is to strike it rich and hit it big consistently over a period of time in the NFL draft. Teams that traditionally draft well eventually contend for championships and are consistent contenders year in and year out. And the organizations and teams that do not draft well continuously are drafting in the top 10 or 15 and missing the playoffs every single year. You look at the Denver Broncos. When you get to the Super Bowl, 10 of their 22 starters will have been drafted by their team. Now, keep in mind, too, that there are several other starters that this team has drafted that are on injured reserve right now, namely Von Miller, Ryan Clady, Derek Wolfe, Raheem Moore. So that's potentially 4 other starters. That could be 14 out of their 22 starters being drafted by their team. So this whole notion that they brought in Peyton Manning and everything came together and he was the only reason that they're in the Super Bowl is ridiculous. They have actually drafted relatively well going back to 2009. You look at 2009, they got Noshawn Moreno and Robert Ayers in the first round. David Bruton, a nice role player in the fourth round. 2010, Demaryius Thomas in the first round. Zane Beadles, a Pro Bowl caliber guard in the second round. Eric Decker in the fourth round. So 2 of Peyton Manning's big weapons came out of one draft, that 2010 draft. It's in part the ability to draft well in other places that allowed this organization to compensate for the fact that they did spend a first-round pick in Tim Tebow in 2010. You look at 2011, this was a good draft for depth. You had Von Miller in the first round. Like I said, he won't even be playing in the Super Bowl. You had Franklin, the right tackle, Orlando Franklin taken in the second round. Nate Irving taken in the third round. Julius Thomas was a fourth-round pick. Their backup tight end, Virgil Green, a seventh-round pick. I just want you to think about that for a second. Eric Decker and Julius Thomas were both fourth-round picks. Those are the type of picks that a team makes when they eventually are going to contend. When you could find guys, Pro Bowl players like a Decker or Julius Thomas in the fourth round, you know you're doing something right. And if you really look at this team, even 2012, being able to get guys like Malik Jackson in the fifth round and Danny Trevathan in the sixth round. You talk about the first and the second rounds usually are where you find your stars. But it's those rounds 3 through 6 or 7 where you find the heart and soul of your team usually. You need some of those guys to step in and become starters. That's where you get the depth for your team. And that's where really good teams really strike it rich in the draft. And the Denver Broncos have. Like I said, Eric Decker, fourth-round pick. Julius Thomas, fourth-round pick. Danny Trevathan, sixth-round pick. Malik Jackson, fifth-round pick. I mean, those are some notable players on that team that were drafted on what would be now the third day of the NFL draft. But they've also struck it rich in the undrafted free agent market. You have to find those guys. You can't just strictly draft your entire team and plug in a couple free agent stars without getting lucky somewhere too. Duke Iheanacho, Britton Colquitt, Chris Clark, 3 guys that'll be starting in the Super Bowl for this team. All were undrafted free agents, not to mention Chris Harris, who may very well have been their second best corner. He was an undrafted free agent. Of course, now he's torn up his knee. The point I'm getting at here is the Denver Broncos for several years have done a lot of good things, believe it or not, ultimately, when you look back in the NFL draft, getting some right pieces, getting some really good value in the middle rounds that have put them in a great position to be able to add some key pieces here and there in free agency like good teams should do, draft the core of your team, and bring in those missing pieces via free agency, and you'll make yourself into a championship contender. And the Denver Broncos have definitely followed that formula when you look at their free agent acquisitions over the past 2 years. Now, like I said before, the Broncos to me have done a good job over the past 5 years of drafting pretty well. They haven't been the best drafters, but they've been good enough for themselves, finding some stars and finding some key contributors and some depth in every single draft class that they have. It's a major reason why they're actually playing for a championship in Super Bowl 48, no question. But the other big component to this is the Denver Broncos Executive Vice President of Football Operations, John Elway, your owner, Pat Bowlen, understanding that they did have some holes and some deficiencies, and they needed to play the free agent market right. Now, obviously, 2 years ago, they took the big step in that direction by being able to beat out San Francisco and Tennessee and be able to sign Peyton Manning. That was an organization changer. That was an instant game changer. There's no question about it. There is absolutely no question about it. Peyton Manning is perhaps the greatest regular season quarterback of all time, one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. When you could find a guy like that in free agency, that doesn't come along every day. That's one of those special circumstances. But, the Denver Broncos, they've had a little bit of luck, too, when it comes to Peyton Manning. Let's face it, it's not such a slam dunk case. The guy was coming off of an entire season missed, not just due to like a torn ACL or something, but we're talking about a neck injury where a lot of people were afraid that one more big hit, one more neck injury, and that's Kaputski's. That's his career. So here the Denver Broncos say, you know what? The talent and possibilities are too good. We cannot pass up on this. And they took the chance and swung for the fences with Peyton Manning, and he's been able to stay healthy, and as a result, they've been rewarded tremendously. So that obviously is the big, huge free agent signing from a star standpoint. You hadn't been able to draft your quarterback, the guys like the Jay Cutlers and the Tim Tebows, so you had to go find your quarterback, and it was like a perfect marriage of timing and opportunity where Peyton Manning came available at a time where you needed to move on from Tim Tebow because he wasn't going to lead you to a championship. But the Denver Broncos have done an outstanding job in the free agent market over the past 2 seasons, and in particular, this past year. You look at Matt Prater, their kicker. He's somebody that was off of the scrap heap from way back when. That's an example of a free agent signing you bring in that contributes for you big. But look at the free agents that they brought in this past offseason. They were able to weaken a team that they actually played in the AFC Championship game, the New England Patriots, by signing away, their best wide receiver in Wes Welker, who comes into Denver, and they didn't have to break the bank to sign him. Giving him I think it was $21 million guaranteed or whatever over 3 years. They didn't break the bank to sign this guy. But now you take Demaryius Thomas and Eric Decker and the development of Julius Thomas, and you throw a legit weapon in the slot like Wes Welker in there. It's a hell of an arsenal for Peyton Manning to be able to work with. But they did a good job in free agency, too, of shoring up that offensive line. Giving big money to Luis Vasquez, giving some money to Manny Ramirez to fill in at center. These are moves, again, you had to protect Peyton Manning. And this really pays off to me when a guy like Ryan Clady, one of the best left tackles in all of football, goes down for the entire season. They've still been able to keep Peyton Manning upright. They've still been able to protect him. They've still been able to give him some time in the passing game, and they've been able to open up better holes in the running game as the year has progressed. And that is due in part to a big money free agent signing like Luis Vasquez, bringing in a guy under the radar like Emmanuel Ramirez, if you will. But then you look at the defensive side of the ball. The Broncos knew after the 2012 season that their defense was not that good. They knew it, even if a lot of the talking heads thought their defense was better than it really was, frankly. They knew they had some pieces to bring in. Yes, you had the whole disaster of a situation, I guess you'd say, with Elvis Dumervil, but they signed Sean Phillips, and Sean Phillips has played very admirably and filled in quite nicely. You look at their secondary, which got torched quite a bit by Baltimore in that divisional playoff loss last year. They knew they needed to add some help in the secondary, so they bring in Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie, a guy incredibly talented, but had a bad year or two in Philly. They bring him in on a 1-year deal. They give him like $6-7 million. They bring him in on a 1-year deal. That was genius, because now you've got a guy who's basically right back in the contract year cycle, and you're going to get the most you possibly can out of him. And he comes in and he plays well for you. But perhaps the biggest free agent signing on the defensive side of the football, especially the second half of the year and into the playoffs, There's former Jacksonville Jaguar Terrence Knighton. This guy has been a difference maker. This guy has been a beast in the middle. He really has. And he is a contributing factor to the Denver Broncos making the Super Bowl, no question about it. So when you look at this organization as a whole, they were able to move on from Mike Shanahan. They got rid of Jay Cutler. They brought in the right guy to run their football operations in John Elway. They ultimately made the right decision in their head coach in John Fox, even though it didn't seem like such a great decision 3 years before that. You could sit there and say, oh, we knew this, we knew that. No, this was a guy coming off of a 1-15 season with the Carolina Panthers. And now John Fox, 3 years later, is going to be coaching in the Super Bowl. They have drafted well. They're not the best drafters in the world, but they've drafted enough of their starters, and they found some stars in the middle rounds of the draft and some key role players and reserves that have had to step in and play well. See Danny Trevathan, for example. And they've also played the free agent market incredibly well. They rolled the dice and gambled and won big, getting Peyton Manning. But this past offseason in particular, they spent some money in free agency without having to break the bank and give out a bunch of bad money, but they signed people like Vasquez and Wes Welker and Terrence Knighton and Sean Phillips and DRC. When you look at this whole body of work, it's actually quite easy to see. Forget how the games were won and how the games were lost. Talk about the offense and this and that. The bottom line is when you look at these things, it's quite easy to understand why the Denver Broncos have made it to their 7th Super Bowl as an organization and why they are on the verge of winning their 3rd Super Bowl as an organization. Hats off to John Elway, Pat Bowlen, John Fox, Peyton Manning, and the entire Denver Broncos organization. You've earned the right. You definitely have. And you've laid that foundation for several years to get to this position. Now it'll be curious to see what you do in a little over a week in Super Bowl 48.